Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report allegedly featuring Triggermen. In this video, we'll be playing the jurisdictional command of Tunguska versus the Neoterran Capitoline army, and the scenario is crossing lines. Now, this video was meant to be a Tunguska Triggermen video. In fact, we'll see a Tunguska list that includes not one but two Triggermen. We'll explain how they fit into the list when we get to that. But in the finest tradition of the best laid plans of mice and men, what this game actually turned out to be was one in which I put three interventors in my list and they spent the entire game flexing on my opponent. And so to actually do Triggermen justice, because there have been multiple requests to feature them in a battle report, we're actually just going to talk through the profile a little bit as if this were a faction-focused video, because they weren't covered in great detail the last time we covered Tunguska, because they weren't playable the last time they covered Tunguska. But they've seen significant improvements since then, notably with the addition of what is probably the best single ability that you can put on any profile in the game, Ballistic Skill Attack +1 Special Die. And that's an incredible ability, not just because it's beneficial in active turn, where it is almost as good as +1 burst. Yes, technically your upper limits for damage are a little bit lower, but not in a way that is usually particularly meaningful, but because it is the only modifier apart from neurokinetics and total reaction that increases your dice count in reactive turn. And it stacks with fire team bonuses, meaning that any model that has +1 special die natively can get to +2 special die for burst 3 in reactive before any other abilities. And that's just good to have generally, but it's especially good on anything that is remotely passable as a gunfighter. And that's the point where we have to step back and look at the Triggerman broader profile and give them, okay, what is actually probably a passing mark these days? I don't think they are competitively optimal, but they have reached up, grabbed onto the handhold, and pulled themselves up onto the ledge of very compelling jank. Because there is just absolutely still an undeniable amount of bloat on this profile. 360 visor, silhouette 4 is a pain in the ass. They're inexplicably loaded with weapons, including two different template weapons, neither of which they can use in the same activation. There's just generally a lot going on here that is pushing their points cost up probably 8 or so points, or in the case of Silhouette 4, adding an inconvenience that is not compensated for by any points discount that it offers. But despite that, this is still a wildcard linkable profile with mimetism, passable ballistic skill, interesting guns, and ballistic skill attack +1 special die, which means that it's something that we can look at in a list and potentially make work. On top of that, it's got access to regeneration at Phys 14, and it is a heavy infantry with passable defensive stats. And that regeneration, okay, listen, it is going to fail. It's going to fail constantly. I've played too many Asawari to tell you otherwise. You will never fail a more statistically improbable number of rolls than regeneration on a high-value heavy infantry, but it does at least technically let you get by without doing things like taking paramedics or doctors for these high-value troopers, which can take the load off of the troop slots that you're taking. And so if we look at Triggermen holistically, yes, there's some bloat. Yes, they're too expensive to be really deeply competitively optimal, but there's enough there to make work, and so we're going to try and do that today. We're actually going to take two different Triggermen. We're going to take the non-neurokinetics multi-sniper and the surprise attack forward deployment profile, and the only one we're leaving at home is the neurokinetics. Now, actually, I think the neurokinetics probably is the most interesting and compelling, because it has such a clear battlefield role. But the simple fact of the matter is, in this list that I'm about to show you, I'm trying to run two Triggermen, and they're very expensive, and I had to cut costs somewhere, and so I thought, let's just see if we can use the +1 special die multi-sniper Triggerman as a combined active turn gun and reactive turn gun. 3 dice in reactive with mimetism and decent defensive stats is still very serviceable, and 4 dice in active turn with a multi-sniper, you barely are even bothered by the fact that 2 of those dice are rolling a special die then, because if you score 2 hits with a multi-sniper, you're in a great spot. Now, a bit more dubious, but which I was really interested to try, was the K1 Combi Triggerman. K1 Combi rifles are a kind of an acquired taste, but the damage increase that the Triggerman's has, going up to damage 6, actually is very compelling, because at that point, there's nothing in the game that doesn't have to at least respect the weapon, because the best case scenario with that K1 Combi, apart from if you have immunity arm, is that you're saving on 9s, and that's better than saving on 10s, but more importantly, it means you go from having a coin flip chance to pass any save against that combi rifle to less than a coin flip chance. And that has some weird knock-on effects, particularly when you start hitting multiple times, which you can do if you're rolling 4 or 5 dice. Oh, how do we roll 5 dice with that Triggerman? It's a decoy model, we can't link it. Actually, in point of fact, you can link models with decoy, you just have to not use decoy. The restriction in the fire teams module is that a model that deploys using decoy can't join a fire team, but if we don't deploy using decoy, we absolutely can, and Triggermen don't have any FTO restrictions, which means we can get that aggressive K1 combi profile into a relatively cheap fire team, and then we've got another model that is rolling 3 dice in ARO and has regeneration. And now we're firing off in active turn 5 dice with that K1 combi, and that's kind of compelling. We also have a 3-die drop bear attack, which makes that very, very accurate if you have spare orders, but realistically we're not going to particularly often. So overall, as an appraisal of Tunguska Triggermen, not necessarily something that I would always be reaching for if I was trying to really sharpen down a competition list, but I also wouldn't exclude them either. Yes, they're a little bit janky, but they are compelling and interesting and playable jank, and although they wouldn't necessarily perform too well for me this game, I certainly didn't regret including them in the list at all, and they were interesting to use. And so, in terms of the list, it's on screen now. Now, this is a list that is trying to have its cake and then have more of its cake and then have more of its cake and eat it too, and as a result, there are absolutely some compromises being made that I wouldn't necessarily recommend under normal circumstances, but hey, this was for casual play on a Wednesday night against a good mate, and to hell with it, this list kinda slaps. So we've got a 9-6 split and no real additional orders, although we do have an Interventor Lieutenant, whose order we will be spending every turn, so it's effectively a 16 order list, and the first combat group with 9 troopers consists of 2 Transductazons, the Triggerman surprise attack with K1 combi, who will be linked with 2 motorized bounty hunters. Now, do I think this is a good idea? Not necessarily, but we have a Kreezer Borak and 2 Triggermen in this list. I don't have any points spare, and the next cheapest option would be regular bounty hunters, who would be regular, but who cost like 3 or 4 more points. And I am already scraping the bottom of the barrel with this particular list, so the idea was, look, maybe I'll get 1 turn of fire team bonuses, then I'll yeet these guys off into the distance or something, but realistically I would try and find an alternate link team for this Triggerman, although there's not really that many that are particularly compelling. The thing about Tunguska fire teams is that they are either very good but kind of very fixed, and that's things like the Hollowman and Nyanmik team, where you have Perseus and Hollowman, Stemplers to flesh it out, like whatever. You can't really just splash a Triggerman into those. I mean, you can, it's not the worst model to declare super jump with, it'll jump as a long skill, it'll move 8 inches, not the end of the world. But those links are kind of doing everything that you already want, and the only thing I could kind of see the argument for is, okay, Hollow Men aren't necessarily the best gunfighters in the world, maybe I can try carting around a Triggerman as a gunfighting piece in a Hollow Man list. I don't hate that, but Perseus is right there with Mimetism 6, and he has super jump and so plays more nicely with them, so that's kind of a, where does the Triggerman go? And so what we're looking for instead is cheap fire teams that the Triggerman can be the star player in. And that's where Tunguska kind of doesn't have terribly many options. The cheapest is the Motorized Bounty Hunter team, or the Bounty Hunter team, which can be built around either MBHs or ABHs. But if you want a specialist in the team, you're probably looking at Chia Killers, and that seems like a very weird thing to say, but that's the next cheapest option. There's a 12-point and 14-point Chia Killer option. Cool, that gets you specialists. Technically, it gets you something resembling close combat. Mostly they are just going to be there to hang out behind and cheer on the Triggerman, and that's probably what I would have gone with if I had 9 spare points in this list. But I don't have 9 spare points in this list. And so motorized bounty hunters it is. We then have an unlinked Interventor Killer Hacker. This is one of my favorite profiles in the game, 18 points, and it is absolutely exceptional. It is purely specialized, but pound for pound, it is the best killer hacker in the game. Like 4 points, it's the best. There is no competition. Anything that competes with it is vastly more expensive than it is. It's also got a fast panda, and it isn't even particularly terrible at defending itself at close range. Love me Interventor Killer Hacker, and because I intend to, in this case, in this scenario, deploy it in the forward deployment zone, it's also happily unlinked, but if I was not playing crossing lines, I'd still have it alone in this combat group with the intention of moving forward. We've then got a Vertigo Zond, because there's some Interventor hackers in the next combat group, a Kreezer Borak, just because I wanted a gun that was not a Triggerman, and I do think that's probably the correct choice. Although if you were looking to cut corners, cutting the Creaser could be something that you could do in this list. Finally, rounding out Group 1, we've got Den McConnelly, who is another model that we'll be forward deploying in this list, making use of the 75 points worth of models that can go into the forward zone. Combat Group 2, then we've got a Puppet Master with 2 Puppet Bots, and these are my dedicated reserve drop in this scenario. Now, they would often probably be a dedicated reserve drop anyway, although the Creaser, for example, would also be an excellent choice. But because we're playing crossing lines, my experience with this scenario is that it's very cool and very fun, and I enjoy it a lot, but you really need to think about what your plan is for those central deployment zones. And in particular, what is your reserve drop that you'll place to respond to whatever your opponent put down there? Because usually on crossing lines, the first order of the game is some kind of incredible violence in the midfield, and you want a piece that can facilitate that, and Puppet Bots are really excellent at it. 2 models as 1 reserve drop. Puppet Master himself just goes back in the deployment zone somewhere. And those shotguns can get immediate value, so these are my dedicated reserve in this scenario, looking to either clear out something tasty on the first order or present a very annoying defense to my opponent. We then have a Zellenkrieger. Zellenkriegers have fallen a little bit by the wayside, but I think in Tunguska they're still excellent, and in fact, if I wasn't taking this Motorized Bounty Hunter link, one of the things I would like to have is more Zellenkriegers in this list. I was beginning to feel an absence of smoke by the mid-game, and I would just have liked another Zellenkrieger. And then we have a 4-person team built around our second Triggerman. As noted, this is not the neurokinetics profile because I did not have any points spare, but there is an idea to use this as an active turn gun if I need to. It's in a 4-person team with a Securitate Repeater and 2 Interventors. Now, again, if I had points spare, I would probably make this 18-point Interventor into a 21-point Interventor so it can serve as a Lieutenant Decoy. I can't do that, and so instead it will just be a regular kind of bodyguard where it will sit a little bit in front of the Lieutenant, and mean any pitcher long bomb on this pair is going to have to fight 2 Interventors, which is not an easy thing to deal with. Another thing that you can do with this fire team is that if you need any active turn hacking, you can just keep the link intact, spend the Lieutenant order, break the Lieutenant out of the fire team, do some hacking stuff, and then it will rejoin at the end of the turn. Be aware that will lose you your fire team bonuses, because the team will no longer have 2 Interventors in it. You won't have that duo bonus anymore, which means the Triggerman will just be firing off the back of its own merit, but by the time you get to reactive turn, the special die will rejoin the link and the Triggerman will be rolling 3 dice in ARO. Now, this would prove to be a bit of an awkwardness this game, which would impact how I played out something. Maybe I should have just spent a command token and reformed. So I do think there's an argument for, don't be cute, just get 2 Securitate to duo with this guy. But it's been too long since I've played with a really meaty hacking presence, and I wanted to run multiple Interventors, and again, 18 points, this Interventor, 21 points, this Interventor. This is some high watermark stuff relative to the points cost in the game, and it's one of the selling points of Tunguska. Now, playing against me this evening will be a Neoterran Capitoline army list, built very much in my own heart. This is a long list of the things that I like in the Neoterran Capitoline army, and that includes, among other things, many orders and many troops. So, what we've got here is a 9-6 split, but there are 3 tactical awareness orders in this list thanks to the presence of the Pathfinder drone bots. So in Combat Group 1, we've got nominally 2 fire teams and then some Fugazis in support, but it is worth noting that these Pathfinders are very flexible. You can have 2 in a fire team if you want, so it's fine to actually decide at the beginning of the game, you know what, we're going to get very aggressive with one of these teams, and so that team will have 2 Pathfinders. However, how they'll be deployed in this game is a Fusilier fire team consisting of an Orc HMG, a blocker. Blockers are outstanding, excellent pitchers, at least a little bit tricky to hack, generally very good value troops, and they count as Fusiliers, so this is a 2-person team. A Fusilier Paramedic, which we need to form the fire team around, and a Pathfinder Dronbot. Pathfinder Dronbots are just one of those things that, like, only Pan-Oceania and a very small number of other factions escaped the purge of tactical awareness forward observer remotes that can join fire teams. You'll see like FTOs and other factions and limitations, and you can't have this and you can't have that. There are a small number of factions that can still take TAC aware forward observer sensor deactivator remotes, and Pan-Oceania is one of them, and Neoterra can have 2 in a fire team. I'm not necessarily of the opinion that you should always windmill slam 2 Pathfinder Dronbots into every list rather, but there's a pretty strong argument for it. They're just very good on their own merits. They're particularly good in Pan-Oceania, where, hey, it's a Willpower 13 specialist, although Pano does have a fair few of those these days. And just the full package of sensor and deactivator is just really valuable. There is more deployable equipment that you can deactivate than ever in N5. Sensor is highly useful, particularly in scenarios like hardlock, for example. Having a sensor is one of the ways of having a line of play if you're going first that stops your opponent from just waiting till the end of the game and pressing buttons. These things are just super high value. And then two Fugazi drone bots, then a Bolt fire team. This is the classic Bolt sniper, Bolt killer hacker, and a Pathfinder drone bot just to give them some tactical awareness to move around. The Bolt can very ably make active turn firefights. The killer hacker is a serviceable killer hacker that's very good at short range, thanks to a marksmanship +1 burst, ballistic skill 13, +1 special die boarding shotgun. Hey, it's got EM mines as well. And between the blocker and the Bolt, what you have is basically sound entry-level hacking. Now, it's not going to compete with, for example, Tunguska-style hacking, but this is Pan-Oceania, and having access to this amount of hacking is very sound. Combat Group 2, we've then got an Ulan. This is my preferred Ulan profile. 70 points makes it the cheaper of the two by a pretty solid margin, and it's a +1 burst wearback. You've also got Panzerfaust and Blitzens to play with, usually as ARO pieces, although there would occasionally be a time where you'll fire off the two Blitzen shots as part of an attack out of surprise. But basically, this is just a camouflaged, very efficient fire platform. It's got very good ballistic skill, it's got mimetism, it's got surprise attack, nothing wrong with that at all for 70 points, and it can defend itself at close range with a multi-pistol. This is a premium tag, like basically all Pan-Oceanian tags, and it's probably one of the best active turn guns you can get in Neoterra. The only bad thing about the Ulan +1 attack burst, +1 burst flareback is that it's not a Swiss missile launcher. However, if we had taken a Swiss missile launcher in this list, we wouldn't have 19 orders and 19 troopers. And the Ulan does offer a little bit more agency, although again, frankly, the Swiss missile launcher can just fight in active turn. We've seen that before on the channel. It can just roll up and hit people with missiles because you only need to hit once with a missile, which it will do reliably. We've then got a Tech B. Because there's no engineer in this list, we're investing just a tiny little bit of insurance in helping the Ulan dodge and having a gizmo kit if need be, but hey, she's 9 points for a regular order and another deployable repeater. And then we have 4 Auxilia, 2 of the cheap forward observers, which also have forward observer Oxbots, absolutely love this profile, and then the lieutenant and a decoy lieutenant, absolutely love this profile as well. Oxbots have been one of my favorite things in the game for a very long time, and so I am very happy to see 4 of them here, particularly in a scenario like crossing lines, where these can represent a very aggressive forward deploying position. There's deployable repeaters. In fact, there are so many deployable repeaters on the forward observers. You can lay down 2 deployable repeaters in one order, thanks to the synchronized profile. But more specifically, what you have are heavy flamethrowers that get deployed in that forward deployment zone and just aggressively contest that space. These will cause a huge amount of problems for me on the first turn. Great choices, and generally I like this list a lot. It's very well rounded. It has an absolute ton of orders. The only thing that I might change in future if I was to run this myself is, probably consider trimming back the Ulan to a Swiss Guard missile launcher and then just seeing what we can get with those 10 spare points. If they allow us to meaningfully change something about the list, well and good. I would really like to include Shona Carano, for example. If I find, no, there's nothing I get from those 10 points that's worthwhile, no problem, the Ulan comes back in. And so on to the game, and actually from here we're moving kind of quickly because this was kind of a silly and fun game where I wanted to do a whole bunch of stuff with Triggermen, but what actually happened, as noted, was that the interventors would spend the entire game flexing. So, first thing that happened is that Willpower 15, win the Lieutenant role, and I elect to go first. I do this because I've got some very big plans with what I want to do with the central deployment zones, and one of those plans includes killing anything that my opponent puts down there. The other plan involves making a lot of use of that forward deploying killer hacker interventor. So we've got some pretty specific plans here in terms of how we're going to be deploying. We'll have the Triggerman with the 2 bounty hunters deployed in this space here. The idea is that the bounty hunters can move out and around up through here while the Triggerman moves up through the building. We do say that he can get through the doorways here. They're just able to admit a silhouette 4, but I do keep the bounty hunters on ground level. The bounty hunters actually roll up some fairly cool stuff, Mimetism 6 and a multi-rifle, but it will not have any impact on the game. The Kreezer Borak is deployed relatively centrally, but there's some important method to it. And then we have the Triggerman multi-sniper up here on this high ground. Now, these are not necessarily hugely commanding positions, although they are quite valuable. The Triggerman sniper basically can see all the way down here past this building and has a little bit of line of sight over these rooftops, but not really so much onto ground level. But between the Triggerman multi-sniper and the Kreezer Borak, what we are doing is covering a lot of this space here, which is important because this stairwell is where I'm going to deploy the Interventor Killer Hacker. It's on the far edge of the 4-inch deployment zone that I've got in the halfway period. And that Interventor is a vulnerable model. I don't want it exposed to gunfights. I want it protected. I want it to be able to press a button and deploy a fast panda. And so what I'm doing is deploying it in a way where basically anything that my opponent would do to pop down models to oppose it, I can respond to with either very big guns or Den McConnelly, who'll be down here behind this truck. The idea is that this Interventor will be as safe as possible. Best case scenario, it's a honeypot that gets me some kills. Second best case scenario is it's free to do what it wants to on my first turn. And so I've picked a position for it that is under heavy overwatch. Otherwise, the interventors are nestled down in this spot here. They are both together, with the idea being that any repeater that lands next to them has to fight both of them at the same time. The Securitate is just being its repeater behind this upturned crate. And then we've got a Zelen Krieger in the midfield over here. For my part, my opponent is going to deploy his Bolt Fire team down here with one Pathfinder, the Orc Fire team nestled in and around this building. We can see the other Pathfinder on ground level there, and the Tech Bee behind this building over here. That's going to end up being a small issue that will matter later in the game, but for now we'll also see two forward observer auxiliars deployed supporting one another in and around this upper ground building, and these two bridges. The auxiliar and the flamethrowers are deployed trying to be able to cover one another. So, cool. My reserve drop, as mentioned, is the Oxbots, and at this point I can basically tell, yeah, okay, there's something big that is my opponent's reserve, most likely, no problem, but I'm willing to risk Oxbots. The first one will go prone on this rooftop, and the second one will just deploy within 8 inches, no one is in cover, staring at this auxiliar, with the intention of taking that auxiliar down in the first face-to-face roll of the game. My opponent reserve deploys his Ulan. It's deployed as a model here, but obviously it is a camouflage marker, and he deploys it in a position where it is watching, basically trying to provide fire support in the same way that I am for my Interventor, trying to provide fire support for these auxiliar. So it's got a good, it's deployed as far this way as it can and still be safe, but it's got a nice clean line down into this ground over here, where it will, for example, be able to see this Oxbot if it activates or if it moves around particularly much. So reasonable reserve. The biggest issue probably with this reserve drop is that it's not a piece that responds quite as immediately to presences in the midfield. For example, if there'd been like a good gunfighter, he could have put it down here, watching the Oxbot, something like that. But reserve dropping the Ulan makes reasonable sense, and he does place it in a position where it can help keep these auxiliars safe. Now, my first turn is going to be something of a comedy of errors and violence, although that's sort of what tends to happen in crossing lines. The crossing lines just generally is a scenario that I really enjoy. It creates a lot of the effect of Biotech 4, where you have a big fight in the middle immediately, but it doesn't force your hand or your play pattern quite as much. Often, as second player, I'll deploy little to nothing in that midfield, just enough to pressure my opponent, and so you've got a lot of player agency, which you don't have in a scenario like Biotech 4. But it's still a scenario that generates that cool and interesting and immediate conflict, that kind of high-octane action. It's also a scenario, I would note, that scales very nicely with competition, where if you are sweaty and competitive, you can build your list and think about how you'll do different things and all of the different points you can put in different zones, and you can have a plan for whether or not you're going first or second, how much do you put in the midfield, if you're going first versus if you're going second, or if you are a more casual player, you can easily just go, anathematic costs less than 75 points, and do that kind of thing instead. In this case, I had a fairly clear plan, and so did my opponent. But what actually happens is that this puppet bot activates. It's within 8 inches of this auxiliar. It fires 3 dice on 18s. It rolls like a 17, a 12, and a 2. Good roll. Auxiliar crits and puts it unconscious. Okay, that's bad. No problem. We will activate the second Oxbot, and it will fight at a bad range band, but it's bad range band for the auxiliar as well. Happily, the second Oxbot does successfully put the auxiliar down, but this is not what I had hoped would happen with the first face-to-face roll. Not least because I wanted this Oxbot on ground level. It would have had to run up through the Ulan's line of fight and fire and get killed, dealing with the second auxiliar, but no worries, I've got a Zelen Krieger over here. It will have to spend more orders than I would like, but it will crawl its way across the bridge under line of fire of the Ulan, get in on, it will die, but it will successfully kill the auxilla. Jesus Christ! Successfully kill the auxilla, which clears out these two auxilla that are sitting in the midfield. And that's really important because these auxilla have heavy flamethrowers, and I really want to do things with this Triggerman team, and I can't run them into heavy flamethrowers. I also can't run them into deployable repeaters because the Triggerman is hackable. But with that way cleared, we will be able to spend just some orders moving the Triggerman and the motorized bounty hunters up and forward to take a relatively forward position. Now, that's all of the violence that's happened in here. I've traded 2 models for 2 models, but ultimately up on attrition there because one of my models was a puppet bot and one was a Zellenkrieger. Now we need to see to what is my left flank. And that means dealing with this bolt sniper over here. Now, what I should probably have done is dropped my lieutenant out of the link, placed white noise, and then just fought the bolt through white noise. It's a marksmanship trooper, it's also an MSV trooper. Let's just take that as a face-to-face roll, drop the -6 modifier, it should be fine. However, doing that would have meant the interventor dropped out of the fire team, which is one of the compromises I kind of made with this list. So I decided I didn't really want to do that. And so what I did instead to stack the odds in my favor is have the Interventor Killer Hack to activate. So it crawls up around here, it lays down its one and only Fast Panda, and then it starts crawling back towards the objective that's over here, inflicting Trinity -3 attacks through a firewall on the Bolt Killer Hacker that is part of the Link team that is behind these crates. Now, the Bolt crits me on the first ARO, but no problem, I am an Interventor behind a firewall, and I am almost invulnerable, and I spang those rolls, and I get it, I think 2 orders later, I put the Bolt down. That takes the fire team bonuses away from this Bolt. With the remaining orders in that combat group, I'm also going to press this button, that's going to be very important a little bit later, and then Cybermask up the KHD, because it's important, it's alive, I want it on the battlefield. And then, with the fire team bonuses stripped from this bolt, I activate the 4 dice active turn gun Triggerman. And I roll something like a 2 and a 4 and a 20 and a 15, and my opponent rolls a 7. And then I fail both of my saves, and then at the end of the turn I fail my regen and the Triggerman dies. And that's part of why this is a list that I wasn't necessarily sure I would do a battle report on, because I wanted this to be a battle report about Triggermen. And instead, this model went the way of every model that you really want to work the first time you field it, and he just ate absolute shit from dice and died. Now, if I had put down white noise, it would not have affected that face-to-face roll at all, but there is a pretty strong argument that I should potentially have put down white noise. Alternatively, I do what I was trying to avoid doing this game, which is that I spend the Lieutenant order anyway, now that I'm safe to drop it out of the fire team, and I spotlight this bolt, and then I drop a missile on its head, and I kill it with a guided missile. Wasn't planning on doing that terribly much this game, but we've just lost the first of our big guns, and to hell with it. It's been too long since I've played with Interventors, let's do Interventor things. Now, despite the loss of the Triggerman, which is a fairly big deal, I am still up on attrition this turn, and I've defanged one of the active turn fire teams my opponent has. As we can see in my opponent's sort of second turn here, I'm also, with the Triggerman no longer on the field, I'm kind of hidden from the Ulan. There's really only one good gunfight that he can take, and that's moving the Orc and company up and around here to move across this bridge to a point where he can get line of fire to the Triggerman. And this is at least where we see some of the value of that Triggerman having 2 special die in ARO. Because what's going to happen is that the Orc and the Blocker will move up and around, the Blocker will fire a pitcher out, it will try and hack the Triggerman a couple of times, but Willpower 13 and BTS 6 will hold, and so the Orc will move up and over to engage the Triggerman in a gunfight, and the Triggerman will actually win that face-to-face roll thanks to Mimetism and the multiple special die. That actually is really fantastic. It means the Orc gets wounded because it's a K1 damage 6 round going straight into a model that isn't armor immune. And what that means is that even though there is now a repeater here, which is going to be modestly annoying, my opponent is out on the back foot reactively, where they haven't been able to punch through the center of strength I have on my right flank. It's actually very difficult to deal with this thing. And especially after the Orc, the only gunfight the Orc can take is revealed to be within 16 inches, he's not particularly willing to move the Ulan up and around, because that just wouldn't be a particularly good face-to-face roll either, and K1 shots into the Ulan are even worse. And so what the bulk of the orders in the second combat group are spent are just moving things around, in particular clearing out this repeater over here so that he doesn't have to deal with that any further, and otherwise just flipping models into the first combat group to make sure that it's got enough orders. And that puts me in a position in my second turn where I've got a little bit of flexibility to make some interesting plays. And so as we head into my second turn, I want to make use of the Interventor Fast Panda again, but it doesn't have a Fast Panda anymore. That's not a problem. I have Speedball for this. Now, I call down 2 Speedballs. One lands, but it isn't the one that I want. The actual reload Speedball is going to go up against this table edge over here. And the second Speedback ball, which will turn out to be a Jetpack, is going to land on this rooftop down here. Okay, that's fine. Now, there is an Auxiliary that's moved up and around to try and secure this position, be a pain for Dan McConnelly. I have been able to deal with the Oxbot, but the Auxiliary is still there. In this particular case, we don't bother dealing with the Auxiliary. We're just going to Cybermask, move across, pick up the thing, move back. If at any point the Auxiliary tries to discover, I will absolutely shoot it with a shotgun, but otherwise I'm content to leave it be. We're then going to crawl up onto this rooftop, stay out of line of fire for now, but get into zone of control of this Pathfinder, and at that point we will break Cybermask, and we will use the enemy repeater to blow this blocker's brains out. There's no real need to drop a firewall onto the blocker. It's got firewall already. It would be nice to have that +3 BTS and give it a -3, but this is an Interventor Killer Hacker with Trinity -3. I'm going to be fine, and in fact I am, and I think it takes 2 orders that we put that blocker all the way down. Now, that's relevant because it kills the last hacker that my opponent has, which means I no longer have to care about the deployable repeater that's hanging out down here. But it's also relevant because it's the last thing I need the Interventor to do before it goes on its glorious flight to freedom. And so what it's going to do, now that that blocker is down and it has nothing else it needs to do, this button is pressed and there are no real enemy specialists nearby apart from this Pathfinder, is that it is going to move forward, and then it's going to, as its last order before it dies, it's going to jet over onto this rooftop, and then it's going to place a Fast Panda down here. And yes, it will absolutely die doing this. It gets nailed by an Orc, it gets nailed by a Pathfinder. I think the Tech Bee even shoots it. But none of that is particularly important, because what it does is it gets a repeater in this space here. And that's very useful because my opponent has made a small positional deployment error. There is a Tech Bee hanging out next to this Ulan. The Lieutenant spotlights the Tech Bee, and then I fire a missile. Now at this point, what I expected to happen is that the Ulan might dodge because it's got a bonus to its dodge, and that's pretty reasonable chance of survival, but I would at least force it out of camouflage, which would then let me possess it, and then shoot the Orc in the back with the flareback, and shoot this Pathfinder as well, and then put itself in the cordyceps position where it's climbing inside area of a repeater. However, what happens instead is that I crit the missile, it fails its dodge, the Tech Bee dies, and it fails all 3 of its saves, which means that in a single order, I just killed 79 points of my opponent's army, and all of a sudden I go, I need to do some really quick retreat math, because that's a lot of damage. And in fact, when we flip over to the next turn, after I have finished running this Triggerman forward in the vain hope of getting something into this dead zone that I'm trying to score, my opponent is mucking around on his phone, and he's like, this is dead, and that's dead, and that's dead. And he looks at me and he goes, is the retreat threshold exactly at 25 points remaining, or is it if I have less than 25 points remaining? Because he has 75 points of conscious models left on the board. The little number is red, we look it up. Yes, if you have 25% or less of your army remaining, you are in retreat, and so he's in retreat. Now, that's not actually necessarily ideal. That's kind of a problem, because there is a Tactical Awareness Pathfinder over here that is still very active. It uses its Tactical Awareness to have a Speedball land, it runs around, it recuperates the Ulan with Auto Repair Kit, and then the Ulan is able to use the couple of remaining command tokens to move into this zone here. Now, he's not reasonably in a position to contest my zone. On the other hand, if he had been, it would have been very close, because the only things in this zone are some one Interventor. My Interventor Lieutenant, as it was doing hacking stuff, moved forward to here, and otherwise I would have, I think, nothing whatsoever in this zone, because I've bum rushed everything forward to try and outscore points. However, the things that I have moved forward are not sufficient to outscore the Ulan over here. With it being back on its feet, it's 75 points. Oh, in case it wasn't obvious, this Pathfinder that is still conscious uses its order to deactivate the repeater over here so that the Ulan can move forward. And that means that at the end of the game, because this is a retreat turn, I control this zone here, and my opponent controls this zone here, and there's no classifieds. But back on the first turn, I pressed this button, which means that I win this game by 1 point. Now, it's not particularly common that that happens in the, but it is actually kind of common that that happens in this scenario. It's not common that this scenario would end in retreat, but what I have found from experience is that the dead zones can be very hard to contest. These, whatever they are, 8-inch periods between the deployment zones, they can be really hard to push into your opponent's one. And so what tends to happen for a lot of games is that each player just scores the closest one, and so those two objectives actually really matter. So if you're playing crossing lines, don't sleep on the buttons, get them pressed and try and hold them, and my decision to use my interventor on the first turn to activate one of them is what ended up making the difference between victory and a tie in this particular game. Now, as noted, I would kind of like to potentially do another game with Triggermen at some point, because the Triggermen didn't really get to strut their stuff too much this game. Part of that was vagaries of dice. This poor Triggerman up on this rooftop just absolutely ate it just due to bad dice. That was a face-to-face roll that it was perfectly serviceable in, 4 dice 13s versus 1 dice 16s. And if I lose the face-to-face roll, I'm probably still fine because I'm a heavy infantry. And even if I fail my saves, I'm probably still fine because I have regen. But in fact, every possible point of bad luck materialized over the course of that, and that Triggerman died all the way down to dead after failing its regen save. So that kind of sucked. But I do think that everything here can kind of work. And this was a very pleasing reminder of the fact that Tunguska interventors are really cool. Now, did I end up killing more than a third of my opponent's army with guided missiles? Yes, that is a thing that happened. Would I have expected that under normal circumstances? No, the Ulan got even more unlucky than my poor Triggerman did. And so instead we had this weird aberrant situation that was a game engine retreat, whoops. Still, it was a very fun game, I had a good time, and at least as far as list construction went, noting that the idea was to try out Triggermen, Triggermen didn't really get tried out, but I was very happy with the overall list. There were some compromises, particularly around the motorized bounty hunters, but I was able to fit in 2 Triggermen and fit in other stuff. This list had a Kreisa Borak, it had 3 interventors, it had puppet bots. I am by no means short on cool things from Tunguska that I like, and that does kind of conclusively demonstrate that, hey, there's a place for Triggermen in the faction now. Also, very happy with the proxies that I've been using, and the modeling possibilities for them are very cool, as annoying as Silhouette 4 is, even on a 6.2 model. So I hope that you've enjoyed this very silly game and this slightly more serious discussion of Triggermen and how they've changed and the profile, and we'll probably be back next week with more Infinity content. Christmas is coming up. I do intend to release videos over the Christmas period, but it might be a slightly ad hoc release schedule because I don't know exactly what my availability is going to be to record videos. Nominally, I should have some, so I hope to put something out. We're past due for a next wave faction focus, but just be aware that the release schedule is going to be a little bit eclectic. Still, until then, if you don't hear from me, I hope everyone has a wonderful Christmas break. If you have time off, I hope it treats you well. If you're working retail or in stores or on the job still, I hope that that's good and that any associated stress is manageable. And I hope everyone is able to spend some time with family and loved ones and catch something of a breather from the year that 2025 has been. I'll see you all again soon for another video, and if that's not before Christmas, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.